Hello, I'm Bill O'Donnell, and welcome to another program on spirituality. I'm indeed pleased to have as my guest once again Father Simeon Gallagher, Franciscan Capuchin, originally from Philadelphia and now the St. Louis, Missouri, and he is in Santa Fe giving a retreat, or just completing a retreat on the spirituality of relationships. We've had Father here before to give us part 1 and 2, so today we pick up with part 3 of the spiritual relationships, and welcome back, Father Simeon.
Thank you.
For those of you who haven't seen that, you don't know what you missed. But you might look for old editions of Spirituality TV, or listen closely, and perhaps there'll be some things in the credits at the end that you can contact him and invite him for giving a retreat in your parish or your hometown, wherever you may be. So anyhow, welcome back, Father.
Thanks. Good to be with you.
Father, I said before, he's a Franciscan Capuchin. You're out of the St. Louis Priory, the Mid-Atlantic region?
Mid-America.
Mid-America.
Yeah.
That sounds good. And it's been a wonderful retreat, as usual, and a lot of people just realize that we do need a lot of help in our relationships, don't we?
Well, yeah, I think that that word spirituality is so flexible today, and it's applied in so many ways, in so many directions. I think it can go from something as sophisticated as monastic spirituality, which the monks, for example, at Pecos would be living in their monastery, all the way over to New Age forms of spirituality. And the classic understanding in the Catholic tradition, the Christian tradition, or for that matter, actually in the Judeo-Christian tradition, is that spirituality is a format or a vehicle that enables us to take off of the realm of the theory and the theology, what it is that we believe, and move it into the concrete, practical circumstances of our lives, so that in whatever context of life we are living, we can find the presence of God and respond to Him in that context. So as a result of that, today we have a plethora of spiritualities, marital spirituality, the spirituality of the single state. A friend of mine who was a Franciscan priest worked many, many years in New Orleans in the French Quarter, actually developed a spirituality of Mardi Gras. Because we can find God present anywhere. And so my contention with these reflections on relationships is that this is such an integral dimension of who we are from the beginning until the end of life, and everything is done in the context of relationships. How can we excavate that dimension of our lives and use a spiritual framework to interpret these relationships that we are in, whatever they might be? And even the relationship that we have with ourselves, let alone marriage and family and friendship and all the other varieties of relationships that we have. And find what God is saying to us, and how He is speaking to us in the context of the way we deal with each other. So I have developed these 4 sessions, 2 of which we've already done. And that first session dealt with the foundation stone, which was faith and trust and confidence. 2 people in any significant relationship, at least, cannot move forward if they don't trust each other and believe in each other and have confidence in each other. And taking that idea of faith and trust and confidence and seeing that in the context of the primary relationship of life, which interestingly enough is not the relationship between ourselves and our mothers. Chronologically, there's a relationship that predates that, and that's the relationship that we have with the God who created us and placed us in our mother's womb. So that becomes the primordial relationship, it becomes the paradigmatic relationship, it becomes the model relationship. So it's always back to that that we need to go. So in that first session that we had together, we explored faith and trust and confidence in terms of what that means in our relationship with God, making a very important distinction between faith and religion, which are not the same thing, although they're integrated and are involved with God, but faith and religion are not the same thing. And then, I don't know whether we covered this or not, but I think we did suggestions at the end of that first session. How can we build better relationships on faith and trust and confidence? The second conversation that we had, if I'm not mistaken, dealt with communication and conversation, because this is absolutely essential to the survival of any meaningful, substantial relationship. If people do not communicate, if they don't converse, if there isn't an open conversation, as we say today, going on between each other, then there is a kind of isolation that develops, and people are not aware of what's going on. And communication, the image that I like to use is the umbilical cord. As the child is connected to the body of its mother in the womb with the umbilical cord, because it's through that cord that all of the oxygen and the nutrition and the flow of blood comes so that the child can become viable on its own. If that umbilical cord is cut, the child can't survive, at least in the womb. And I believe that communication is the umbilical cord of relationships. And I know it's very difficult because many people find this topic of communication extremely uncomfortable. And I think that they fall into two categories. One group of people finds this uncomfortable because they don't know how to do it. And the reason for that is because many of us were raised in families where the tendency years ago, if you had a problem or a conflict, was to not address it. Consequently, it would go away or it would evaporate. And of course we know it doesn't go away. It sinks itself, hides itself, buries itself inside the relationship, and it shows itself at some point, usually in a very destructive fashion. There's another group of people who finds the topic uncomfortable because these are the people who simply won't do it. They simply won't communicate. They don't think that they have to give an accounting of their lives to anyone, which is tragic if they're involved in any kind of a permanent relationship like marriage or family. When they're out of the house, no one knows where they are. No one knows where they're coming home. The dinner waits forever for their arrival. And would they find a cell phone to call home out of simple human decency and say, I'm going to be late? No. Well, I mean, this is impertinent and arrogant and basically self-centered behavior. And this does not facilitate healthy relationships at all. So communication is not a peripheral or coincidental dimension, it's central. And in that second session, I try to place that, again, within the model relationship of our relationship with God, using the insights of one of the Catholic Church's greatest women saints, Teresa of Avila, who put the two together. She put prayer and communication into the same framework and said that prayer is nothing more than communication. And we can learn, I believe, in our relationship with God if we have healthy images of Him and images that truly are growing and maturing and developing. I mean, I can't relate to God, you can't relate to God at the age that we are in the same way that we related to Him when we were kids in grade school. Cardinal Newman said the only evidence of life is growth. And if we're not growing, then what happens to us? We're either already dead or in the process of dying. So like any relationship, there's got to be growth in communication, and that's tied a great deal to the image that we have of God. Is it developing, maturing, growing? So that we're older now and we're dealing with older people's conflicts, older people's struggles, and we turn to a God who has grown up and grown old with us. So the second session tried to stress the importance of growth in communication, the importance of communication, and how the image of God is so central to any kind of a healthy prayer life. And from out of that healthy prayer life, we learn how to communicate better with each other.
I think that was an interesting point because a lot of people don't relate their prayer life as helping their personal life,
Right.
their relationship with other people. Can you explain a little more about that? How does prayer help communication?
Well, if it depends again on the image that you have of God. Now, this is not my own idea. I love to swipe ideas from people that are much more wise than I will ever hope to be. But in the Middle Ages, you had this collection of theologians, St. Thomas Aquinas, who was a Dominican, St. Bonaventure, who was a Franciscan. Many of these men spoke in a Latin phrase that the lex credendi est lex orandi, which means, in basic translation, that the way that we believe is equal to the way that we pray. So when I go into prayer, if the God on the other end of this communication is a bomb shelter that I only dive into when I have problems, then I don't think we can develop too much of a communication with that kind of an image of God. We need to turn to the scriptures and realize that the image of God that he offers us is an image of God that demands the best of us, and rightfully so, because we give glory to God by becoming all that we can be, but also a God of tenderness. You can't read the 23rd Psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," without realizing that this is a God of great tenderness. So when I come out of an experience of prayer with a God who rightfully demands the best of me, and doesn't do this because he's malicious or vindictive and mean, but because he loves me and he wants the best for me, then isn't it true to say that I learn in that conversation, if I'm a married man, to demand the best of my spouse and she of me? Or if I'm a parent, to demand the best of my kids? Or if I'm a teacher, that I demand the best of my students? And we don't do this because we dislike them or we're trying to be a burden to them, but we give glory to God by becoming fully alive, becoming all that we can be. And of course, that's St. Irenaeus of Lyon, one of the earliest theologians in the church as far back, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 4th century, 5th century. My dates are not always accurate, but nonetheless. So the image that we have of God teaches us how to do better communication with each other. I always think of my own experience. I was raised in an Irish Catholic family with wonderful parents, hardworking immigrant Irish people. And my father, of the two of them, was very tough in his own kind of way. And I went to the seminary, and many of my professors were of German extraction. Wonderful people, the Germans. Hardworking, task-oriented, very focused people, but tough in their own kind of way. And, you know, my dad demanded the best of me. My professors demanded the best of me. And I kind of, you know, was uncomfortable with that growing up, but I think in the long run it has stood me in good stead. So these images that we have an awful lot to do with the way, I believe we could actually extend this. You know, if Bonaventure and Aquinas are correct, that the lex credendi est lex orandi is accurate, and I believe it is, maybe moving on that Latin little phrasing, we can say that the lex credendi est lex operandi, which means that the way that we believe is equal to the way that we work. And we can even say that the lex credendi est lex vivendi, which means that the way that we believe in God has an awful lot to do with the way that we live. So all of this image of God, relationship with God in prayer leads me to a better relationship, I feel, in communication at least, with the people with whom I deal. So those first and second sessions of the 4 sessions dealing with relationships laid the groundwork and so forth for some of the concepts that I was trying to get across. This third session is what I would call a reflection on the darker and the sadder side of this relationship issue. Because when we look across the scenario of relationships today, we don't see in all cases a very happy picture. If these percentages that are given to us of failed marriages is accurate, then over 50% of our marriages in this country end in failure, if that's accurate. But it's not just marriages, it's family life. Unfortunately, youngsters are raised today with families, and there's not an awful lot of communication. They don't sit down to a common meal together. Everyone's very, very busy. In some cases, you need almost a flow chart to schedule everything that everyone's doing. And I realize I'm not insensitive to how difficult life is today, but we have to make a conscientious effort to spend time together, especially when there's kids present, because kids need to be bonding and they need to have a sense of belonging. And if they don't get it at home, then unfortunately what many of them do, they find it where? In street gangs who will offer them a negative experience of bonding rather than a grace-filled experience of bonding, presuming that the family structure is as healthy as it possibly can be. So we have this sad picture of brokenness. This is the Christmas season. And sometimes we communicate with friends that we have spent in the past years and efforts developing friendships. And now we find with embarrassment that we only deal with these people once a year, and it's by way of a Christmas card. And for heaven's sakes, we don't even sign the card. We have a printer put our name on the card for us, or we send one of these Christmas letters that we think satisfies that important level of communication. And it's basically soccer scores from Tommy and little Mary's dance schedule. And I don't think that's the kind of quality communication that takes us anywhere. It's information transfer, but it's not communication. And we need that deeper communication, especially in the world of so much brokenness. Now, I believe that if we go to the Judeo-Christian scriptures, and we analyze this business of sin, that we can see the way sin is impacting upon the world of our relationships. Why? Because in the Judeo-Christian tradition, sin is never, ever presented as just an individual action that has nothing to do with anyone that is around me. There's always an interpersonal repercussion in the Judeo-Christian tradition about sin. It's always an interpersonal reality.
Give us your quick definition of what a sin is.
Well, it's a failure to be faithful in the relationships that we are engaged in. It's a failure to make any attempt to mend broken relationships, because fundamentally sin is not just simply and only a juridic infraction or a legalistic kind of imperfection. Yes, when we sin, the laws and the rules and the commandments are broken. No doubt about it. But those rules and laws and commandments do not stand out there in a vacuum by themselves. They are visible articulations of the internal reality of relationships, so that when we sin, failure to be faithful, failure to make any effort to mend broken relationships, what's really being damaged is the world of our interpersonal relationships. The example that I would use is, here's a kid at the local supermarket standing in the exit line surrounded by walls of candy bars and bubble gum, and the kid fills his pockets with these and gets out into the parking lot without being detected. And he could be led to believe, because he hasn't been caught, that he's done nothing wrong. Here's a housewife who goes shopping, and in some store, deep in the back of the store, outside of the surveillance cameras, she's able to change the price tag on a garment, making it cheaper, and she gets away with that without being detected, and she thinks that she's done nothing wrong. Here's a businessman who stops on the way home from work and fills his briefcase with pornography, which he brings home and hides in a box in the basement under his work table, and thinks that, well, there's nothing wrong with that. Well, the reality is that what the kid did and the housewife did and the businessman did affects every one of us, because we're not in this human journey alone. We belong to the human family, and in our faith context, we belong to the people of God. And so what one person in a family doesn't pull his or her weight, the whole family is affected. So sin is impacting in that fashion on the world of our relationships. And it's very important that each of us come to terms with this. And I think that we're living in a culture, unfortunately, that has lost a sense of sin. And I don't say that simply because I am a priest, but I would quote the Menninger Clinic of years and years ago. These psychiatrists who run that clinic in Topeka, Kansas, all of whom are wonderful professional men, but they were so concerned years ago that people were coming to the clinic for counseling, and they noticed that these people never mentioned the word sin, never stopped to think that anything that they were doing in the world of their relationships was right or wrong. And so they published a book. Again, my dates might not be accurate, but it was way over 30 years ago. It was on the New York Times bestsellers list for months, and the title of the book, Whatever Happened to Sin? So it isn't just a churchman making this observation about the culture that we've lost a sense of sin. It's even the psychotherapeutic and psychiatric communities who are recognizing that this has become a great problem. And it's not that we want to become scrupulous and obsessed with the notion of sin, but on the other hand, we don't want to become so lax that we never take into consideration the reality that we are all selfish in many ways. Whatever Adam and Eve did in that garden, one of the repercussions of their original sin, that Pandora's box that they opened, is that even the best of us can be unbelievably selfish, thinking only of numero uno. And that's the reality of sin. It's a failure to be faithful, to be present, to continue to be involved, to be caring, or else the refusal out of a kind of hard-heartedness, not to make any overture, not to take any initiative toward a person with whom we've had a falling out, so that there can be a mending of that broken relationship. And the tragedy today is that we find this hard-heartedness, this toughness, even in the very places where we should never find it, and that's in our families.
In all our relationships.
Well, yes. But, you would think that families would have enough connectedness to be able to want to do that. But you're right, it happens in all relationships, but it's so particularly poignant in its painfulness when it comes out of the blood bonding of family.
Can you say a little words, just parenthetically, about that? Because we have so many broken families now, and just some advice on, in your experience as a pastor, on how to counsel people when you have a difficult situation. Say where a family member won't talk to you, or has disappeared, or or a child is wondering, what about their parent? Why did he leave or she leave, and why am I alone?
Yeah. Well, I do believe that we have to come at this with a very realistic point of view, which might be actually something to be taken up in the next session. But I think that we need to appreciate that these relationships, whatever they are great blessings in our lives, but they're not easy. There is no such thing as an easy relationship. There are times in every relationship, even the best of relationships, where there's going to be conflict and struggle and pain. Now, thanks be to God, we have an entire supportive, psychotherapeutic, counseling, psychiatric community around us to whom we can go, and we should never be ashamed to go, because sometimes the impasses that we create cannot be resolved except with the help of a professional person. I also believe that we have to pray a lot for a specific intention, and that specific intention is the healing of memories. Because every one of us can look back at times in our lives when we can remember that we have been misunderstood, mistreated, times in the past when we have not been represented correctly, abused in many ways, and we want to pray for the healing of memory so that we can move on and be more present to each other in our relationships with forgiveness and with mercy. This is so important for families in particular, that we never reach a point where our hearts become so hard with each other that the mercy and the forgiveness that God has extended to us would be forgotten in the way that we want to extend that to each other. And I think also that families have to make a concerted effort at deeper communication, more availability to each other, so that that these relationships, which I believe are meant to be fulfilling and satisfying and happy, can become that rather than terrible burdens filled with dysfunctionalism and brokenness and so forth. Now, may I also say, from a realistic point of view, because it's important that we be realistic, there are indeed some relationships that are so profoundly dysfunctional, so much water over the bridge or under the bridge and over the dam, and so toxic in their antagonisms and in their history of dysfunctionalism, that to be realistic, we have to admit that there's nothing that we can do except graciously and amiably separate ourselves from these kinds of relationships. That would seem to me to be the mature thing to do. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't leave these kinds of relationships amiably. They leave them with hostility, rancor, anger, resentment, never wanting to address how to resolve that. And unfortunately, what happens is that these seeds are planted again in another relationship and in another relationship, so that there is this ever increasing circle of pain and struggle. And one relationship becomes contaminated with the unresolved agendas of a previous relationship. We're intelligent people. We can resolve these kinds of things and move apart from each other with the kind of understanding that human beings who have the grace of intelligence can do. And we should struggle to do that. So I hope I'm giving both the positive dimensions as well as the realistic dimensions of what we have to deal with in the world of our relationships.
Well, right now we have to come to the realistic realization that the dimension here today is going to come to a close. I want to thank you, Father, for giving us part 3 of this series of talks on the spirituality relationships. I think it's been very helpful. We hope that something that Father Simeon Gallagher has said to us today will be of value to you in your life. And also we want to encourage you to stay tuned this time next week for another program where hopefully we'll get into part 4 and to wrap up and to sum up and to have some good ideas and recommendations for you in your life and in all your relationships. So, Father, thanks again for coming back. I look forward to having you next week. So on behalf of everybody here at Spirituality TV, I want to thank my director, Marshall, my camera people, Tom and Wendy, and all the sponsors that have helped us out. And we want to encourage you in your spiritual life and whatever circumstance you're in. And we'd like to hear from you. So watch the credits, give us a call or write us a note. Let us know what you think of this kind of programming. And if you'd like to support us, we'd like to have your help as well. So on behalf of everybody, thank you for viewing, and stay tuned next week at this time for another program on spirituality.